conference room fell dead silent when I walked in. 14 of the most powerful men on Wall Street sat around that mahogany table, their eyes following my every move like predators sizing up prey. I had just closed the biggest merger in the firm's history, $12 billion that would reshape the entire energy sector. But when I opened my mouth to present the final numbers, CEO Harrison Mitchell interrupted me with a laugh that cut through the air like a blade. Listen to that voice, gentlemen. Sweet as honey, isn't it? His words dripped with mockery as the other executives chuckled. Maybe we should send you to negotiate with the ladies' auxiliary instead of Fortune 500 CEOs. That was the moment I knew they had never seen me as anything more than their token diversity hire. That was also the moment I decided Harrison Mitchell would never laugh at anyone like me ever again. Growing up gay in America teaches you to read rooms before you even enter them. Coot, you learn to modulate your voice, adjust your walk, choose your words carefully. In corporate America, this survival mechanism becomes an art form. Every morning, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror in my Tribeca apartment, practicing the deeper register I'd use in meetings, rehearsing the firm handshake that would mask any hint of perceived weakness. For 15 years, I climbed the ladder at Morrison & Associates, one of the most prestigious investment firms in Manhattan. Graduated summa cum laude from Wharton, earned my MBA from Harvard, and could analyze market patterns like reading sheet music. But none of that mattered when partners whispered about whether I was executive material or questioned if clients would take me seriously. Proving your worth to people who see your identity as a liability before they see your capabilities is exhausting. Every day felt like an audition for a role I was already qualified to play. I watched straight colleagues with half my experience get promoted while I was passed over for being too soft for aggressive negotiations or not. Quite the right fit for representing the firm's image. Con. The financial world runs on perception, and in their eyes, I was always perceived as less than, less masculine, less reliable, less worthy of the respect that came so naturally to my heterosexual counterparts. But what they failed to understand was that being underestimated had become my greatest advantage. They thought they were erasing me from their story. But what they didn't realize was that I had been writing my own ending all along. Ever felt judged for being exactly who you are? This story is for you. Subscribe to this channel because here, your voice matters. And stories like this don't stay silent anymore. Let's turn pain into power together. Kingdom, my name is Daniel Chen. And at 38, I had spent more than half my life learning how to exist in spaces that weren't designed for people like me. The 42nd floor of the Morrison & Associates building offered a stunning view of the Hudson River, but I rarely had time to appreciate it. Cut. My days started at 5 a.m. with market analysis from Asian exchanges and ended well past midnight with calls to European clients. My corner office was modest compared to the senior partners' suites, but I had earned every inch of it. The walls displayed my degrees, industry awards, and a single personal photo. Me with my partner Marcus at our commitment ceremony in Vermont. It was subtle enough not to raise eyebrows, but present enough to remind me why I fought so hard to succeed. The microaggressions came in waves, each one small enough to dismiss individually, but devastating in their cumulative impact. During client dinners, servers would automatically hand the check to my straight colleagues, assuming I couldn't possibly be the lead. In presentations, my ideas were frequently attributed to male associates who had contributed nothing but their presence. Partners like Richard Hawthorne would make comments about my attention to detail in a tone that suggested it was somehow feminine rather than professional. The worst part wasn't the obvious slights, it was the invisible barriers. Being excluded from golf weekends where real business discussions happened. Watching as younger, less experienced analysts were groomed for partnerships while I was kept in my lane. Hearing whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered a room. But I had learned to navigate these waters with precision. I became indispensable by being better than everyone else. My client retention rate was 96%. My deal closure success was the highest in the firm's history. I spoke Mandarin, Japanese, and Korean fluently, opening doors to Asian markets that my colleagues couldn't access. Called. I made Morrison & Associates more money than any other VP in their roster. Yet, when promotion discussions came around, there was always a reason I wasn't quite ready. Too young, then too specialized. Then, lacking the right leadership presence, the goalpost kept moving, but the game remained the same. Make the gay guy prove himself over and over again, while straight, men with trust funds and golf handicaps sailed into senior positions. Marcus would find me some nights staring out our apartment window at the lights of Manhattan, carrying the weight of every dismissed idea and overlooked achievement. Cut. He reminded me that my worth wasn't determined by their recognition, but I knew that in corporate America, perception was everything, and their perception of me was filtered through decades of unconscious bias and calculated prejudice. Played. The turning point came when Harrison Mitchell announced that Morrison & Associates would be bidding on the largest energy sector merger in the decade. SolarTech Industries was being acquired by Continental Energy for $12 billion, and whoever led this deal would essentially guarantee their partnership track. It was the kind of opportunity that defined careers. I had been tracking both companies for 2 years, analyzing their market positions and predicting this exact scenario. My research files were thicker than phone books. I understood their corporate cultures, their financial vulnerabilities, and their strategic needs better than anyone in the firm. When Mitchell called the meeting to assign the lead negotiator, I walked into that conference room knowing I was the obvious choice. The announcement should have been straightforward. My track record spoke for itself. I had closed similar deals worth over $8 billion in the past 3 years. My relationships with both SolarTech's Asian investors and Continental's European board members were solid. I had even predicted the merger 6 months earlier in a strategy memo that Mitchell had personally commended, but when Mitchell stood up to address the room that Tuesday morning, his eyes barely met mine. Instead, he focused on the row of senior associates seated across from me. All of them straight, all of them white, most of them mediocre. "Kind of deal requires our absolute best," Mitchell began, his voice carrying the gravitas he reserved for major announcements. Continental Energy is traditional, conservative. Their board consists of oil industry veterans who value certain established approaches to business. I felt my stomach drop as the subtext became clear. He continued without pause, explaining how the lead negotiator would need to embody the firm's core values and represent their institutional strength to skeptical stakeholders. Every euphemism was a carefully coded message about what kind of person they believed could handle this responsibility. The assignment went to Bradley Westbrook, a 35-year-old associate whose greatest achievement was being Harrison Mitchell's golf partner. Bradley's experience with energy sector deals was limited to a single pipeline financing that I had actually structured for him the previous year. But Bradley looked the part. 6 feet tall, square jaw, married to a sorority sister from SMU, and possessed of the kind of confident mediocrity that corporate America mistakes for leadership. Cool. The room erupted in congratulations as Bradley basked in handshakes and backpats. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, watching my career's defining moment being handed to someone whose qualifications wouldn't fill a single page of my resume. Cohen. When Mitchell asked if there were any questions, I raised my hand with practiced composure. "I'd like to request a supporting role on this deal," I said, my voice steady despite the fury building in my chest. Cut. My relationships with SolarTech stakeholders could be valuable to the team. Mitchell's smile never wavered, but his eyes turned cold. "Daniel, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but we need you focused on your current client portfolio." The Nakamura account requires your particular expertise. The dismissal was surgical in its precision. AIT, he had effectively sidelined me to manage Japanese mid-market deals, while the biggest opportunity in years went to someone who couldn't even pronounce the names. Of the key players involved, the message was clear: know your place. But what Mitchell didn't understand was that my relationships with these companies ran deeper than quarterly reports and conference calls. Over the next few weeks, as Bradley stumbled through preliminary negotiations, I continued my own research and relationship building. I attended industry conferences where SolarTech executives were speaking. I met with Continental's Asian subsidiaries who were nervous about the merger's implications for their operations. The more I learned, the more obvious it became that Bradley was leading the deal toward disaster. His approach was aggressive where it should have been, collaborative, American-centric where it needed to be globally minded. During team meetings, I watched him present strategies that showed a fundamental misunderstanding of both companies' corporate cultures. Meanwhile, the whisper campaign against me intensified. Richard Hawthorne made pointed comments about my communication style being too soft for tough negotiations. Junior associates who had never seen me work began repeating secondhand assessments of my capabilities. Cohen, someone started a rumor that my success with Asian clients was only because they preferred dealing with fretting representatives. The prejudice stopped hiding behind professional courtesy. During a partners' dinner that I wasn't invited to, someone let slip that they had discussed whether my lifestyle would be appropriate for representing the firm in Texas, where Continental Energy was headquartered. The implication was that my identity was a liability that could jeopardize the deal. Marcus found me that night, sitting in our kitchen at 2 a.m., surrounded by financial reports and market analysis. I was building a parallel strategy for the merger, working twice as hard as Bradley's entire team just to prove that I could have done better. Quote, the irony wasn't lost on me. I was investing more energy in a deal I'd been excluded from than the person who was actually running it. Why are you doing this to yourself? Marcus asked, his voice gentle but concerned. Cunt! I looked up from the spreadsheets that had become my obsession. Because when this falls apart, I want to be ready with the solution. 3 months into the merger negotiations, Bradley's inexperience began showing cracks that couldn't be hidden by corporate doublespeak. Polartech's board was growing frustrated with the cultural insensitivity of Morrison & Associates' approach. Continental's European investors were threatening to withdraw support due to miscommunications about regulatory compliance in Asian markets. I watched the deal deteriorating from the sidelines, my warnings dismissed as professional jealousy. During weekly status meetings, I sat quietly as Bradley presented increasingly desperate revisions to salvage negotiations. That should have been straightforward. Confidence was crumbling under the weight of responsibilities he had never been qualified to handle. The breaking point came during a crucial video conference with SolarTech's board of directors. Bradley had scheduled the meeting for Tuesday morning, apparently unaware that it coincided with a major Buddhist holiday observed by 3 of their key decision-makers. When the SolarTech executives expressed surprise at the poor timing, Bradley responded with casual dismissiveness that bordered on cultural disrespect. Kide. I watched the video feed from my office as SolarTech CEO, Jennifer Kim, terminated the call with polite firmness. Within hours, news leaked that SolarTech was considering alternative merger partners. Continental Energy's stock price dropped 4% in after-hours trading. The $12 billion deal that should have elevated Morrison & Associates to industry leadership was imploding spectacularly. Mitchell called an emergency meeting for Friday afternoon. The conference room that had buzzed with congratulatory energy 3 months earlier now felt like a funeral home. Bradley sat at the table looking like he had aged 5 years. His usual swagger replaced by the hollow stare of someone realizing he was in over his head. Gentlemen, Mitchell began, his voice heavy with barely controlled anger, we need to discuss the SolarTech situation. For 30 minutes, I listened to them dissect the failure with surgical precision. Proudly, they analyzed Bradley's missteps, Continental's growing impatience, and SolarTech's alternative options. They discussed damage control strategies and face-saving measures. But not once did anyone acknowledge that these problems could have been prevented. When Mitchell asked for suggestions, I finally spoke up. I have maintained relationships with all the key stakeholders throughout this process. SolarTech's board still trusts Morrison and Associates, but they've lost confidence in our current approach. If we restructure the team and address their cultural concerns, we might be able to resurrect the deal. The room fell silent. Bradley's face flushed red with humiliation. Richard Hawthorne leaned back in his chair with a condescending smile that made my skin crawl. "Daniel," Mitchell said slowly, "I appreciate your optimism, but this deal is beyond salvaging. Bradley has followed our strategic guidelines precisely. If SolarTech can't appreciate our methodology, perhaps they're not the right partner for us." The gaslighting was breathtaking in its audacity. Quote, "They were rewriting history in real time, transforming obvious incompetence into principled business philosophy. But what happened next revealed the true depth of their prejudice." Furthermore, Mitchell continued, "This situation has highlighted some concerns about team dynamics and communication issues within our ranks. Effective immediately. Daniel, you'll be transitioning to our London office to head up European operations." The room spun around me. They were exiling me to London for the crime of being right. The promotion was technically a lateral move with a salary increase. But everyone in that room understood what it really meant. They were removing the gay guy who made them uncomfortable with his competence. I sat perfectly still as they outlined the transition timeline. 2 weeks to wrap up my current portfolio, a month to relocate. Immediate separation from the SolarTech deal and all major American mergers. They were erasing me from the story just as cleanly as they had ignored my warnings. When the meeting ended, I returned to my office and closed the door. Kane. The view of the Hudson River that I rarely had time to appreciate suddenly seemed like a goodbye. Common to Morrison and Associates, 15 years of my life, generated hundreds of millions in revenue, and maintained relationships that none of my colleagues could replicate. And this was my reward: professional exile disguised as career advancement. That evening, Marcus found me packing boxes in my office at 9 p.m. Carried. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway, watching me carefully wrap the photo from our commitment ceremony in tissue paper. "They're sending me to London," I said without looking up. Cooing. 2 weeks, he moved closer, his presence solid and comforting in the fluorescent emptiness of the office. "What are you going to do?" I looked up at him then, and for the first time in months, I smiled. "Going to show them what happens when you underestimate a lamb." What Mitchell and his team didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment since the day they gave my deal to Bradley. While they were busy managing their public failure, I had been quietly building something they never saw coming. During those 3 months of watching Bradley fumble the merger, I hadn't just maintained relationships with SolarTech and Continental. I had been positioning myself as the solution to their growing frustrations. Every industry conference, every casual lunch meeting, every phone call had been strategically designed to demonstrate what competent leadership looked like. Jennifer Kim from SolarTech had reached out to me directly after the disastrous video conference, expressing her disappointment with Morrison and Associates' approach. She remembered our conversations from previous industry events and valued my understanding of her company's Asian partnerships. More importantly, she trusted my cultural sensitivity in ways that Bradley had never earned. Similarly, Continental Energy's European board members had grown frustrated with the American-centric perspective that dominated the merger discussions. My fluency in multiple languages and my experience with international regulatory frameworks had made me their preferred point of contact, even though I wasn't officially part of the negotiating team. The night after my exile was announced, I made a series of phone calls from my apartment overlooking Central Park. The first was to Jennifer Kim, who was in Seoul meeting with potential alternative partners. The second was to Heinrich Vogel, Continental's lead board member, who was growing increasingly concerned about the deal's viability. "Jennifer," I said when she answered, "I understand you're exploring other options for the merger." Her voice was cautious but interested. "Daniel, I'm surprised to hear from you. I thought Morrison and Associates had assigned Mr. Westbrook as our primary contact." "They did, but I'm calling in a personal capacity. I'm leaving Morrison and Associates to start my own consulting firm, and I wanted to offer my services to help resurrect this deal on terms that actually work for both companies." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours. Jennifer detailed her frustrations with Bradley's cultural insensitivity and Mitchell's inflexible approach. She explained how SolarTech's board had lost confidence in Morrison and Associates but still believed in the strategic value of the Continental merger. Most importantly, she confirmed that SolarTech would be willing to work with an independent consultant who understood their needs. My call with Heinrich Vogel was equally productive. Continental's board had grown tired of Bradley's amateur hour negotiations and was concerned about the deal's impact on their European operations. Heinrich had personally recommended me to his colleagues after our previous interactions, noting my comprehensive understanding of international energy markets. "Mr. Chun," Heinrich said in his precise German accent, "if you were to establish your own firm, would you be interested in representing Continental's interests in this merger?" By midnight, I had secured preliminary consulting agreements with both companies. Proit's side, they wanted me to broker the deal that Morrison and Associates had bungled, working as an independent third party to resurrect the $12 billion merger that everyone thought was dead. The next morning, I walked into Mitchell's office with my resignation letter and a proposal that would change everything. My letter was professionally worded but emotionally devastating. I was leaving to establish Chen Strategic Consulting, specializing in international mergers and acquisitions. My first client engagement would be facilitating the SolarTech Continental merger that Morrison and Associates had abandoned. Mitchell's face went through several color changes as he processed the implications. Not only was I leaving the firm, but I was taking their biggest potential deal with me. The commission on a $12 billion merger would be worth more than my entire 15-year salary at Morrison and Associates. "You can't do this," he said, his voice barely controlled. "You signed a non-compete agreement." I smiled for the first time in months. "Actually, Harrison, I checked with legal." Cackled. "The non-compete clause specifically prohibits me from working for competing investment firms. It says nothing about independent consulting or representing clients that you've already abandoned." The beauty of the situation was that Morrison and Associates had no legal recourse. They had publicly admitted that the SolarTech deal was unsuitable. They couldn't claim ownership of a client relationship they had officially terminated. And they certainly couldn't argue that I was stealing opportunities they had already failed to capitalize on. Over the next 6 weeks, I orchestrated the merger from my new office in Midtown Manhattan. Chen Strategic Consulting consisted of me, a brilliant assistant named Rachel Martinez, and a conference room with a view of the Chrysler Building. But my relationships with SolarTech and Continental ran deeper than Morrison and Associates' entire infrastructure. The deal came together with surgical precision. I addressed every cultural concern that Bradley had dismissed, structured financing terms that satisfied both companies' international obligations, and navigated regulatory requirements that Morrison and Associates had never understood. Jennifer Kim later told reporters that working with Chen Strategic was like finally speaking with someone who understood the global nature of modern business. When the merger was announced in the Wall Street Journal, the headline read, "Independent Consultant Closes Record-Breaking Energy Deal." The article detailed how a former Morrison and Associates executive had salvaged the industry's largest merger after it had been abandoned by traditional investment firms. My commission was $48 million. On the day the deal closed, I received a text message from Bradley Westbrook. Contained only 3 words. Congratulations, you won. But the real victory came 3 months later when Morrison and Associates announced they were laying off 15% of their staff due to declining revenues. Prollersikta's SolarTech deal would have been their biggest commission of the year, enough to secure bonuses and job security for dozens of employees. They were forced to make cuts that devastated careers and shattered the illusion of their institutional invincibility. Harrison Mitchell resigned 6 months later, citing personal reasons that everyone understood were professional failures. Richard Hawthorne was quietly demoted to a junior partnership role. The firm that had spent 15 years underestimating me was now struggling to survive in a market that rewarded competence over conformity. Standing in my new office overlooking Manhattan, I often think about the journey that brought me here. The boy who learned to hide his voice grew up to become a man whose voice couldn't be silenced. The young professional who was told he wasn't executive material built his own executive suite where competence mattered more than conformity. Chen Strategic Consulting now employs 12 people with offices in New York, London, and Hong Kong. Pre-specialize in cross-cultural mergers and acquisitions. Working with companies that value diversity of thought and global perspectives, my team includes brilliant professionals from 6 different countries, representing various backgrounds and identities that traditional firms would have overlooked. The weight of those 15 years at Morrison and Associates hasn't disappeared, but it's transformed into something powerful. Every microaggression became market research. Every dismissal became motivation. Every moment of being underestimated became a strategic advantage that my competitors never saw coming. Marcus and I bought a house in the Hamptons where we host dinner parties for young LGBTQ+ professionals breaking into finance. We talk about navigating corporate cultures that weren't designed for people like us, about turning prejudice into power, and about the importance of building our own tables when we're not invited to theirs. The industry has taken notice. Harvard Business School invited me to lecture about international deal structures. The Financial Times named me one of their rising stars in global finance, SolarTech, and Continentals. Successful merger has led to 6 more major deals, each one worth tens of millions in commissions. But the most satisfying moment came last month when a young gay analyst from Goldman Sachs reached out to me for career advice. Carrot had heard about my story through industry networks and wanted to know how to navigate prejudice while building his own success. I told him what I wish someone had told me 15 years ago. They will try to silence you, but they cannot stop you from becoming undeniable. They will try to marginalize you, but they cannot diminish your worth. They will underestimate you, and that will become your greatest weapon. The corporate world is slowly learning that diversity isn't just politically correct, it's profitable. Companies that embrace different perspectives and global awareness consistently outperform those trapped in outdated cultural assumptions. The future belongs to organizations that recognize talent regardless of who loves whom or how someone sounds when they speak. I am no longer the lamb they thought they could dismiss. I am the voice they failed to silence, the competence they refused to recognize, and the success they never believed possible. And every day, I wake up grateful for their prejudice, because it taught me to build something better than anything they could have given me. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible in rooms where you deserved to be seen, then this channel is your home. Subscribe and hit that notification bell because we're building a community where your voice matters, where your success is celebrated, and where your identity is your strength, not your limitation. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below with your own experiences of turning prejudice into power. And remember, they may try to write you out of their story, but you are the author of your own success. Here, we don't just survive in their world, we build better ones. Welcome to Chen Strategic Consulting, where being underestimated is just the beginning of proving them wrong.